I'm going to start by kicking us off on data mapping a little bit and talking about, just from the experience of doing this with hundreds of organizations, what are some of the things we've learned along the way? And one of the key things is, how do you just make it very repeatable and scalable and have some structure around data mapping? And a lot of times you get started, and the first question that comes up, and Nick and I were talking about this earlier, is, okay, you immediately run into a terminology issue. So what is a data map? And what does that mean based on who you're talking to in the organization? So I'm going to break down a few different ways we've seen it, and then Belinda and Nick, of course, can add a little bit of their color as well. So there are different terms you'll see organizations use. So the first is this concept of an inventory. So a data inventory. And typically the way we see this used in practice is, this is the underlying, tabular spreadsheet format of your records. And the columns represent sometimes the different things required in Article 30, and even more broadly, the things that your data governance program might be tracking. So very simple, it's usually a spreadsheet type representation. And then we always see the word data map used. And data map typically we see used as a term referring to more of a visual-based representation. A lot of times the data map is generated based on the underlying information in the data inventory. And of course, there are different ways of graphically representing a data flow that are easier to interpret a lot of times. And so then the third thing I'll mention is this concept of data discovery. And so a lot of organizations we work with separate this concept of data discovery and data inventory and mapping into different phases, where data inventory and mapping is more of the systematic, questionnaire-based business context type questions, and data discovery is more of the automated, let me just go pattern match and find where do we have sensitive data. So just to maybe frame it up, and Nick, I'll kind of ask you, based on your experience, do you see different types of terms used, or how have you seen those?
So you could have an inventory being the spreadsheet listing out what we had on that earlier slide. You might call that a data map or a data inventory. Equally, one technique we use is to have what we call flow diagrams at a high level. It's not something that feeds directly into GDPR analysis. It's just something to help us get our heads around where data is going across the organization. So in a simple example, even if you just think about it from, mapping out what you would need for binding corporate rules or model contracts, you'll have servers in locations, arrows usually pointing to the US, possibly India. It follows a certain pattern. Of course, every organization is different. The more important thing is getting to getting the detail right, rather than necessarily what we badge it. But it is, as you can appreciate, a lot of this is very new. No one was doing this 10 years ago to any level of detail, even 5 years ago. And so it's being created kind of, it's changing the wheel on a moving vehicle to some extent, I think, for many organizations. Belinda?
Certainly my experience, both at Pearson recently at a large international bank, is that data governance and data mapping are part of the same piece. And to a large part, it varies about which part of the organization is driving this. So it could be that it's being driven by a new data governance team. It could be driven by the CIO team. It could be driven by the CISO team from a security perspective. And certainly my experience is that data mapping or data flow mapping, or whatever you want to call it, means different things to different people. And I'll just take a few words from the privacy context. One of the key points is, what is the overall purpose of this? Is it to identify all the data assets, or is this part of helping your wider privacy compliance program? And if it is, that's where it's really important for the privacy lawyer or privacy professional to try to insert themselves into this process. Because if the organisation is expending a lot of energy and resource on this, then let's make sure, for example, if this is going to help you with your Article 30 records, that you've managed to incorporate those requirements. And one of the personal items that I often see missing from data flow mapping is where purposes of processing is not being picked up, and that's an obvious gap. The other part, of course, is the international transfer. If you're looking at what is our international transfer compliance program, whether it's the whole hog with BCRs or whether it's just model contract transfers, you also need to be able to identify the international transfers going on. So I think my main point is it's really important that the privacy lawyer, privacy professional, whoever has started this data mapping exercise, inserts themselves, and if there's a GDPR or privacy compliance issue, that they feed into that.
Yeah.
I think you hit on a really good point, Belinda. So one of the most common, I would say, mistakes or causes of extra effort that we see companies do is you go internally and you say, okay, we need to do data mapping for GDPR. So what does that mean? And the IT or information governance team will say, done, we already have that.
Yeah.
Okay, and then you break that down and you say, okay, well, GDPR doesn't really say data mapping anywhere. It says, well, Article 30, records of processing.
Yeah.
And of course, data mapping is kind of this broader activity that if you're going to do it, you might as well also solve Article 30 along the way. So I think you hit on a really good point. And then there's another level of detail here where Article 30 breaks down what's required for controllers versus what's required for processors. So I guess, Nick, maybe a question for you is when you've worked with your clients, do you see them think about their controller use cases separately from processor use cases and mapping things differently?
I would say yes, but with prompting, it's not the most immediate thing.
Yeah.
Because it's one of those little subtle kind of legal distinctions that we'll all be familiar with in this room, but is not necessarily the priority. So again, to go back to Belinda's point, I mean, you do find situations where, we're brought in to start the GDPR project. Don't worry, we've got a data map. Here it is. And what it is, which is great, it's a good starting point, but what it actually is a list of IP assets.
Yeah.
So that's useful, but it's not a GDPR analysis. It raises a question, actually, which we've looked at for some clients, as to whether you want to, if you're going to spend all this effort and money on mapping, why don't you take account of the IP architecture as well?
Yeah.
And actually identify, but there you're getting into IP ownership, licensing terms, what you can do with the data from an IP perspective, and that, of course, locks, like we talked about earlier in the earlier session, locks together. But it is substantively a very different exercise.
When you say IP, you're meaning
intellectual
non-personal
Yes,
data
absolutely.
that they may also have mapped.
Yeah, so you've got you're outsourcing your HR processing to Workday. What about the licensing arrangements for the software? Who actually has access to it? That can be a value add. So we sometimes find that if there is a data map in existence, it's a good starting point, and it helps get into the rest of the interviews and fact find that we need to do. But it's a starter for 10 rather than necessarily. Yeah. In fact, it's very unlikely to be the complete picture.